So welcome everybody to our research seminar for this week. And this is sort of the second half of this series of lectures, because from now on, we're always going to have speakers in person right here, and they're all our colleagues. So they're all from Manchester. And so yeah, I'm excited to learn more about what our colleagues and friends are working on. I don't actually know much about Leonie, so I asked Eva to help out and say a few introductory words about Leonie.
Well, it's great to have you here, Leonie, and up and running, and here in person. So I'm going to keep it brief at this stage. So if I remember correctly, Leonie, you came here as an exchange student, as an undergraduate student from Augsburg,
more or less,
Germany.
yeah.
And then you liked Manchester and you stayed to do an MA, and you became interested in language policy and language contact matters, and then went on to do a PhD. Which is on the topic of today's talk on the maintenance of Arabic in Manchester. And you can already see the quotation marks around Arabic language, which is to signal that it's not a homogeneous entity, which I guess we'll hear more about. I had the pleasure to read your PhD thesis, and it's really a very fine piece of work and lots of detailed observations, from the labeling of jars in a kitchen to sort of the setup of a supplementary school, and sort of what people comment on what's appropriate for whom to learn in terms of what's Arabic. So you really took ethnographic research and participant observation seriously by becoming a learner of Arabic and immersing yourself in your settings. And I really like your title, so take it away.
Thank you, thanks a lot. Apologies for the delay, but I hope everything's now up and running. Welcome everyone, I'm really delighted to be here today and to see you all in the room and on Zoom. I hope you can all hear me well. Yes, today I'll be speaking about the making, marking and remaking of boundaries, Arabic language and community in Manchester. And as Eva has said, thank you by the way for the introduction, this talk today is based on my PhD research, so I'm excited to speak about that today. So why is it interesting, or why is it important to study community? Well, community is a notion that is quite routinely used, often as a taken for granted concept in a way. You can hear it in public discourse, in political discourse, but also in academic writing and in research. We use the notion, the term, quite a lot. But it has also been challenged. It's one of the most highly contested notions in sociolinguistics, you can say. But still, researchers and language users continue to rely on it. So it's important to study it, to look at it, particularly in the current context of increasing diversity and complexity with increasing globalization processes and concomitant mobility of language users, of groups of people and of individuals. So what is community? Community in public and political discourse is described and defined in various ways, or simply used without really putting much focus on what it really means. So you'll hear a lot about language communities, where the definition of community seems to be based obviously very clearly on language, so the Urdu-speaking community, a Francophone community, or based on ethnicity and origin. So the Italian community, for example, here it's difficult to distinguish, of course, between language and origin, but you can see the term used quite a lot as a very taken for granted notion. Then there's the faith-based community, if you will, practice-based, where routine practices and shared interests somehow seem to define communities. Place-based, you'll see that quite a lot, particularly in policy papers, the neighborhood communities, local communities, and so on. So this is just an example from Manchester University website: inspiring local communities, community project, community promise, neighboring communities. This is part of the Greater Manchester Combined Authority website. Here, speaking of being part of a very strong local community. And in one of the policy documents published by Manchester City Council that is on language provisions, so interpreting and translation provisions in the city, this document expresses the aims to identify and promote an understanding of the linguistic needs of our community. So here, the idea of community seems to be associated with people who speak languages other than English and seem to have some kind of lack of English proficiency. They have certain linguistic needs. So as you can see, it's used widely in public discourse, and it's been used widely also in academic literature. You may be familiar with Chomsky's notion of the ideal speech community that is imagined as completely homogeneous. Obviously, that is a very theoretical construct and is for theoretical purposes and not for the purposes that I'm looking at, that we're looking at today, namely how communities are practiced and imagined and being experienced also. Then the notion of community is very central in sociolinguistics, and there it's been used quite traditionally as a unit of analysis often, and it's been understood in a way as a quite homogeneous and coherent, almost objectively identifiable social entity and linguistic entity, based mainly on regular interaction, and where through regular interaction, linguistic repertoires, but also certain norms and perceptions about the appropriateness of language use are shared by members of that community. So if we look, for example, at Fishman, 1971, says that all members of a community share at least a single speech variety and the norms for its appropriate use. And similarly, Labov says, or he allows actually for some heterogeneity within the community. So it's not, the communities are not necessarily homogeneous in terms of language practices. The linguistic resources across individuals in a community are not necessarily the same, but the ways in which language resources are associated with non-linguistic or extra-linguistic attributes, with social class, for example, or gender or age, that seems to be coherent across members of a community. Now, Himes takes a step back and puts community much more in the social context and focuses more on the social aspect of community than linguistic practices and resources as such. And Gampers argues that communities are not limited to one language, but there are certain elements of shared linguistic repertoires. So in this sense, communities are distinguishable one from another. So it's not necessarily one language with only one community with only one language, but members of a community share linguistic resources. And then there's the notion of community of practice that I'm sure you're also familiar with. Here, there's a shift away from some kind of essentialized notion or category of community towards practice. So through practice, through shared practice, routines, and so on, members of a community develop shared norms about language use and also shared linguistic resources. And here there is very generally a move away from the fixity of community. So communities perceived as dynamic and as developed and practiced over time, but still there is an understanding that, for example, regular interaction will create shared norms and shared practices, and that will then define a community of practice. Community of practice allows for multiple membership and interaction of complex identities, so that's also a very important point. Let's move away for a moment from the notion of community to language policy, because that is another notion that was very central in my PhD research. It wasn't at the beginning, because the initial idea was to explore language and community as such, but I noticed more and more how important it is to actually look at language norms and the ways people police language, and then relate that to practices of identity and to people's linguistic repertoires, and how all these complex notions interrelate. So just very briefly, language policy and traditionally language planning. In the field, there was a very clear focus on declared and very explicit language policies. So policies in terms of language choice, what kind of languages are supposed to be used in the public domain, for example, which languages seem to be appropriate, but also policies in terms of language provision. So traditionally, the field of language policy and planning looks at those explicit and declared policies. But then more recently, there has been a bit of a shift, or let's say opening in the field, opening up, where there's been much more of a focus now on the practiced policies, how in interaction at the very micro level, people negotiate policies and norms of language use. So it's not only, the focus is not only on explicit policies and norms, but also implicitly negotiated policies. So a very central model of language policy, of how to understand language policy, is Spolsky's model, where language policy is perceived as having these three different dimensions: attitudes and beliefs, so ideologies and the discourses that surround language use and elements of language or linguistic repertoires and resources. Then language management, and these are the very explicit efforts of managing language use that can be at the macro level of really defining a language policy, or at the very micro level of language use and interaction. In a family, for example, where the mother would tell their children how to use language and how not. And then there is language practices at the micro level as a very, very important dimension of language policy. Now, putting both notions together, there has been some discussion about it in the language policy literature about the notion of community has been used, but again, it's been taken for granted and not really looked at. So for example, Shaham and Spolsky say that members of a community share norms or rules regarding appropriate behavior, and policies are then derived from such rules. So this reminds us of Labov's or Fishman's definitions of people, of members of a community sharing norms about language use. So here, language policy is understood as operating within communities, but it's not really clear what communities are. And also, it's if we perceive language policy as being practiced and dynamically developed in interaction, then it's very difficult to imagine how there is a body of members of a community that share specific norms, because if they change, then how can we understand community and language policy and their interplay? A very similar understanding has been developed in the field of family language policy. So how are languages managed and policed in the family setting? Again, there's an understanding that families have their own ways of speaking, acting, and believing. So here, the notion of community of practice is really useful, because it kind of helps us understand how language policies are practiced. But again, the family is perceived as a somehow defined unit of analysis as the community of practice. And through regular interaction, family members will then have a shared understanding of what counts as appropriate language use. Now, questions arise. I've discussed some of them already. This seems to suggest a relatively fixed notion of language policy, even though, as I said at the beginning, there has been very recently an emphasis on looking at the ways that people practice and negotiate policies in interaction. And also, it seems to be based on a rather definable and fixed understanding of communities. And most importantly, I think those definitions don't account for how language users actually perceive language and community boundaries and what they perceive policies and norms to be. Yeah, I said at the very beginning already that particularly in this current setting of superdiversity, of increasing globalization and complexity really in terms of linguistic repertoires and populations, it's becoming more and more important to actually have another look at the notion of language in its interplay with community. Because there has been this focus on unpredictability and complexity rather than using these traditional boundaries and categories that have been used previously. So it's becoming increasingly difficult to understand community as language-based or also as place-based. But let's have a look at Arabic in Manchester now. I'm conscious of the time. So yeah, just very briefly, Arabic is a very interesting and important case, I would say, to look at language and community boundaries and negotiations because of its sociolinguistic complexity, of its great linguistic variation, because of its religious significance and related religious identities across language groups and transnationally, but also because of the way it's been used really across the globe. So it has this transnational reach and it has really this complexity also that it brings with it. In Manchester, we can find there's a long-standing presence of Arabic speakers, so that dates back to the early 20th century or even late 19th century. Well, we can draw on census data from 2011. We're expecting more up-to-date data in the coming months, but there are more than 7,000 speakers of Arabic in Manchester, well, or at least individuals who declare their main language to be Arabic. Manchester has been defined as Manchester has been defined as being home to the UK's second largest Arabic community. So yeah, and numbers are rising with recent waves of migration due to wider historical events. So just very briefly, Arabic is spoken across countries and continents. And you can imagine there is very great linguistic variation between colloquial varieties of Arabic, but then we have modern standard Arabic, which is a variety that's spoken and written, but not acquired by children in a natural environment and not spoken in any way. So those colloquial varieties are the ones that are spoken in everyday use. Modern standard Arabic is a more or less artificial variety that is used for writing and reading, but it is very different from some of the colloquial varieties. And then we have classical Arabic, which is the language of the Quran. Okay, so how can we speak about a language-based community? Well, it's difficult because of this great linguistic variation. Arabic is also spoken as a second language across other language groups. So we have many Kurdish and Somali speakers, for example, who also speak Arabic. Then Arabic speakers will have acquired additional languages along their migration routes. And then we have this religious element where Arabic will have been acquired to some extent, particularly by Muslim individuals or groups from across the globe. So here people will not necessarily use Arabic as a language in everyday communication, but they will have some familiarity with it. So practice-based, we can think of Arabic being used in some kind of practice communities, for example, faith-based communities. This is a sign from South Manchester. Trilingual and Arabic is one of them as some kind of almost emblematic language for the religion Islam. So briefly about my PhD research, I explored a variety of questions and notions, and it's been really difficult to kind of put all this into a presentation, but just very briefly, I looked at the ways that individuals and groups negotiated community and language boundaries, how they negotiated positionings and power relations within particular groups and within and across settings, language policy, and other related questions. I was lucky enough to do my to complete my fieldwork before lockdown. So this might explain why I was able to do fieldwork across sites. So I conducted fieldwork in a family setting at 3 Arabic supplementary schools. These are Saturday schools that teach heritage languages, in my case Arabic, on the weekend. So pupils attend those alongside their mainstream school education. I conducted fieldwork across 4 businesses in Manchester, and also I did a placement in at a public service interpreting and translation agency in the city. So just to give you a brief impression, these were my field sites across the city. And to give you a better idea of what I actually did, as Eva briefly mentioned also at the beginning, I engaged with participants in various roles. One of them was my role as a student researcher, but then also as a language learner. So this gave me very interesting insights into the ways that people had certain beliefs and ideologies about language, also in respect to what they would teach me, what they would not want to teach me, how they would correct me and others, and how they would explain to me why certain forms of language were correct or incorrect. Then, as I mentioned, I did a 6 months placement at an interpreting and translation provider. Then I was multilingual Manchester researcher, and through various engagement activities, I engaged with people from different organizations and individuals around the topic of Arabic language. So I conducted participant observation, informal interviews and focus group discussions. So some of it was audio recorded, but most of it was not, because the idea really was for me to, for example, in the supplementary school classroom, to be a language learner primarily, and through that get an understanding of what was going on and becoming part of the setting. So I looked at spoken language use, at written language use, so-called linguistic landscapes, what I abbreviated here as LL. I analyzed interview transcripts, fieldwork notes, any kind of documents, and I also had a research diary, which was really important for my researcher reflections. Yeah, let's have a look at language use in the family setting. So I briefly give you an overview of who the family is that I worked with, or that I engaged with. The family is a family from Syria who arrived as refugees in 2017 or 2019. Right. Different family members arrived at different points in time. We have the parents in their mid-50s. They had, at the point of fieldwork, a rather limited proficiency in English, but they were well fluent in Arabic, in spoken written Arabic. Then for sons, teenage and adult sons, one of the sons joined the family only in 2019, and that added to the complexity.
I'll get in touch with the hotel in Copenhagen.
Language practices and proficiencies really in the family setting, because he came with a very different understanding. Before he had lived in Egypt, and he then had very interesting ideas about how language should be used, particularly by the daughter. So yeah, the daughter, she came here with very limited Arabic skills, because she had never actually learned how to read and write, and she knew spoken Arabic, but as soon as she came here, she learned English very quickly, and she was the family member whose English proficiency was the highest in the family. But all children were born in Syria. I think I've not mentioned that. Yeah. So in terms of self-reports of family members, they suggested that there were no declared rules and both English and Arabic was accepted in the family setting. But through my observations, I saw that this was much more complex than family members perceived it to be, or than they reported it to me. Arabic was clearly predominant, and there were certain implicit policies, and that there were language games, for example, that this eldest son who came to the UK slightly later than the others played with the daughter to encourage her to speak Arabic and to avoid speaking English. The jars in the kitchen is just an example of how the family, particularly the mother, used Arabic in writing to create some kind of Arabic home. This is how she called it in the focus group interview. So she used different ways of writing Arabic, well, not different ways, but on different kinds of different labels. So there was art, for example, showing some kind of Arabic calligraphy, Islamic prayers on handwritten notes, then notes on letters on the fridge. Those were both English and Arabic, depending really on the author of the letters and notes. Labels on food jars, as you can see here in the kitchen. And we can see a variety of functions of language use. So it's not only to communicate information, but also for some kind of emblematic purposes. And in the focus group interview, for example, when asked about it, the mother explained how this somehow helped her get the atmosphere from back home in Syria to the Manchester setting, and to also create a certain sense of dominance of the Arabic language here in this setting. So in a way, this helped connect the past and the present. Now, I saw Arabic maintenance practices, so very explicit efforts to teach the daughter, particularly Arabic, as a form of language policy, because it really, again, somehow renegotiated the hierarchies of languages in the house. The daughter, particularly at the beginning of my fieldwork, seemed to speak English quite a lot, and the mother was very clear in that she wanted to maintain the Arabic language. So every day they had, or they still have actually, short Arabic lessons, and particularly the focus here was on literacy skills. So Arabic here doesn't necessarily mean the Syrian variety of Arabic that is spoken in everyday interaction, but it was here much more the standard variety, and also classical Arabic when sometimes she used the Quran to teach Arabic to her daughter. So interesting to see was how I observed some of the lessons, and how during those lessons certain forms of Arabic that the mother perceived as non-standard and not correct, those forms were corrected during the lessons, but not outside the lessons, because during normal dialogue that was perceived as appropriate. So these kind of linguistic hierarchies of the various varieties were quite dynamic and changed depending on who participated in a particular interaction, and also when, in what kind of setting. So what role does English play in all this? This was something that I found, particularly at the beginning, very interesting to observe, how the parents made great efforts to acquire English while maintaining Arabic. So they recognized the relevance of English in the diaspora setting, and therefore English, I perceived English acquisition also as part of the family language policy. So there was quite creative efforts to maintain English. For example, the mother used to go to a church Sunday tea and coffee event just to practice her English, for example. And they also, both parents used to watch a lot of YouTube videos and so on to improve their English. And then there was also the English lessons with the daughter. So you will remember, as I just said, the mother, every day the mother teaches Arabic to her daughter, but on the weekends she asks the daughter to teach English to her. And this somehow renegotiates the ways that family members position themselves in the family during those lessons, but also outside, because it gave the daughter a certain space to use English very deliberately to renegotiate how certain languages are perceived as appropriate or language resources and others not. So this is about, I'll just go through it very briefly, an extract from my focus group interview. And I asked the mother about these English lessons, and the mother explained to me, so the daughter, she's a very strict teacher, and she gives me punishment because I don't write my homework. Then my punishment is to take her to Primark to buy many clothes, about £60. And when she says, I'll start my lesson, she wears lipstick, rouge, and she wears a red blouse to match to lipstick. The daughter was around 11 at that point. And high heels, and then the mother continues, yes, high heels, and she wears my bag on her shoulder. I said, why do you do that? And she said, like my teacher, and she's very strict. Don't use your mobile, don't drink, don't use gum. Strict, very strict. So this is just an expression of how the daughter used her English proficiency to kind of appropriate a different role. And she also explained, like my teacher, so she kind of, in her mainstream school, English is the majority language. English is the default language, the language that's expected to be used. So she now uses her position to, during those lessons, when she teaches English to her mother, to also assume some kind of position of authority. I'll have to be a bit quick. I'll try and cover what I was planning to. So there was also an understanding that without English, you can't do anything here. And here in the diaspora setting in Manchester. So that involved, for example, access to public services, but also there was a sense that using Arabic in public settings create some kind of sense of or process of disempowerment and disadvantage in interaction with others who speak mainly English. I don't think I can go into detail here. For example, the parents tried to avoid using interpreting services, even though their level of English was quite low, but they had experienced how, they're both doctors, by the way, how their professional let's say non-linguistic proficiencies were devalued when their English proficiency was perceived as very limited, when they were relying on interpreters, for example. So in this way, in the diaspora setting, again, the sociolinguistic hierarchies change, because it's not only the family and that determines what kind of languages are appropriate when and where, of course, but also other social relations and understandings of appropriateness of language use and so on. Now also the neighborhood community was relevant in terms of family language policy. This, for example, related to children, neighbors' children who also spoke Arabic. Whenever they were in the family home, I observed that particularly the daughter found it easier, or she then used Arabic that somehow was more likely than if the children weren't in the home. So in this sense, again, family language policy is negotiated not only in the setting of the family, but within the wider setting. Yeah, I think I will, well, just very briefly, in the focus group, I asked about perceptions of community. Well, I did so only after the mother spoke about the Arabic community. So I asked her, so do you think there is something like an Arabic community? And then the son, the eldest son, replied, yes. For example, when we meet Assyrian doctors, we use Arabic, and that that is something that he perceived as a community. And here it's a shared origin, but it's also shared linguistic repertoire. Here Arabic was Syrian variety of Arabic, and it's also a shared professional background. There was also understandings of an imagined community where, for example, there's a Syrian community organization where they would go to events and meet others who they hadn't even known before. So they were meeting strangers, but that was still perceived as a community. And the sense of belonging in this sense was institutionalized on the basis of a sense of membership or belonging to that community organization. You may be familiar with Anderson's notion of imagined community that is imagined within nation states. I think I'll have to skip this here to be able to briefly speak about a second setting, the supplementary schools. So I looked at 3 supplementary schools. I conducted fieldwork in 3 different Arabic supplementary schools, and it was just fascinating to see how different their approaches were to language teaching. So if we have a look at one school, often referred to as the Libyan school in Manchester, where most teachers and pupils were of Libyan origin, the qualifications offered were Libyan qualifications. So they teach the whole Libyan mainstream school curriculum. And the idea is, or the original aim was for children and their families to return to Libya and to make it easier for the children to then continue in the mainstream school system. So the target language here was fluency in the Libyan variety, but also modern standard Arabic for reading and writing. Now, a second Arabic school, there was the pupils and teachers were mainly Syrian, but then throughout the pandemic, the school opened up and started teaching online, and then pupils are now based across the globe, really. In terms of qualifications, these were school internal qualifications, and the target language was modern standard Arabic for reading and writing, but the teachers explained the target language to me as some kind of middle form of Arabic, because they argued that you can't teach children to speak modern standard Arabic because no one actually speaks it, but we're trying to avoid very strong dialect elements. So the aim was really to help maintain language in the diaspora setting, but also to teach some classical Arabic. And now the third school, this was the school that I spent most time in as a language learner. This school explicitly welcomed teachers and pupils from diverse backgrounds in Manchester. So they had pupils from various Arabic speaking backgrounds, but also non-Arabic speaking Muslim backgrounds, if that makes sense. The qualifications offered there were UK qualifications. So GCSE in Arabic, A levels in Arabic. The target language, modern standard Arabic. So it was very, very clear in the classroom that teachers wouldn't accept the use of colloquial varieties of Arabic. And that was difficult for the pupils, and I think also difficult for the teachers, but they said it's important to teach modern standard Arabic because that's the correct variety, and that's the one that will be recognized as a skill here in the UK. So very briefly, this is the online presence of the Libyan school. You can see it's very clearly, the identity is somehow very clearly based on the country of origin. The emphasis is on fluency, and that can be Libyan Arabic, and there's a non-English policy in the classroom. Libyan curriculum is taught, and it in a way replicates the educational settings in Libya or anywhere else in the Arab world, really. Yeah, so the idea was to create an atmosphere and to create a sense of community where the language is shared. The second school had textbooks designed for learners outside the Arab world, and the target language was that neutral middle form of Arabic. And then with COVID, the school opened up and is now teaching Arabic to pupils based in Canada and Netherlands and so on. So this in a sense creates an international, transnational community where pupils most of them are of Syrian background, but living in the diaspora across the world in a way, connect online, connect through Arabic. They here in the Manchester classrooms, pupils will speak English and Arabic, but in these meetings where pupils meet from the Netherlands, who are now living in the Netherlands and other countries across the globe, their shared language will be Arabic, or actually Syrian Arabic. So there's a certain orientation towards a transnational community based on a shared interest in Arabic. I will, I think, have to skip this to just be a bit brief. The third Arabic school is the one, as I mentioned, that's the one I spent most time in. And this, for example, is a video posted on their Facebook page. You don't need to read this, it's really just about the video discusses these challenges of maintaining and also acquiring heritage in the UK setting. So it very clearly addresses these complexities of community and of language here in the UK and in the diverse UK setting. So you can only imagine how difficult it is in a classroom where there's pupils who speak Arabic fluently in their homes and others who don't at all. But they all are somehow connected through that shared interest and shared alignment with the Arabic language. So in terms of language policy and practice, as I mentioned, there's emphasis on modern standard Arabic, and there was a preference for the use of English over non-standard varieties. So whenever pupils use the variety, or whenever pupils used the Arabic that they knew from home as Arabic, teachers would correct them and say, that's not Arabic, that's Libyan, for example. And this just shows the complexities also of what language means and what forms of language mean across individuals, really. Because for the parents in the home, they are probably happy if their children speak their own form of Arabic. But then in the supplementary school, suddenly that doesn't count as Arabic anymore, because the aim here is to teach a variety that is recognized widely as a skill. So thinking about community and language, that's a banner of the school that they use at their events and also online. So you can see the diversity really of flags that somehow represents the multilingual, multi-dialectal community. So we have flags of Arabic, of countries where Arabic is spoken. We have flags of Muslim countries where Arabic is not spoken as a majority language for communication, and so on. So this is just a reflection of the transnational composition of that supplementary school. And now if we think of all that as a community, it's getting really, really even more complex now to define. Also, the UK flag is represented here, and that's in a way in line with language policy, because there is a recognition that all the teaching is taking place in the UK setting, but then at the same time, the language that's taught, or the target language here, is modern standard Arabic. So it's not actually all these varieties that are spoken in the different countries, but they are all connected, or they all align with modern standard Arabic in a way. So just to briefly conclude, community is very complex and multi-layered. I'm not sure if we've really, if we can say there is a definition of community, because I don't think there is. But I argue that it's really, really important to look at the various dimensions of it, to look at how community and language interlink, but also how people negotiate what counts as correct, what counts as incorrect, what counts as appropriate, and also where the boundaries are. I think I wasn't really able to explain that very well on examples, on the basis of examples today, but I invite you to read my thesis. Then also the multiple membership is really, really important. I mean, that's not something that I've come up with now, but I just, yeah, my research has just shown how important it is. For example, the focus group with the Syrian family, I just asked, and I think for 5 minutes everyone had their different ways of belonging to and experiencing community and where the boundaries are and so on. Then language is also complex, and we know that. There's an understanding of, for example, diglossia and triglossia and so on, are based on the idea that there are these hierarchies of language resources and prestige. But I think it's really important to look at how sociolinguistic hierarchies are negotiated in the very moment, and how certain forms of language are perceived as appropriate in particular settings or moments in time, but not in others. Language policy is shaped by a variety of factors across time and space. I think it's really difficult now to think back about the notion of, or about the idea that members of a community share norms of language. I mean, first of all, what is a community? And then they continuously negotiate their norms in everyday life, really. So it's difficult, yeah, to argue that community members share language policies or vice versa. There are those internal dynamics, but also external factors play a role. And the wider diaspora setting affects these dynamics. And now I use the term interactional regime or regime to try to encompass that it's not only, language policy is not only language policy management practice and the ideologies and beliefs, but it's much, much more than that at various scale levels, really. It's at the micro level or micro scale, and macro level policies and so on, but also so many different dynamics that come into play. For example, these complex and dynamically negotiated sociolinguistic hierarchies that need to be taken into consideration. And I think therefore that language policy as such, for example, in the field of family language policy, it doesn't necessarily capture everything that will shape the ways that people use and police language in the home and outside the home. Yeah, I think that was almost it. Yeah, so now there is these two ways of orienting to language and to identity and community if you want to find some kind of general pattern, or at least that's what I found in the Manchester setting. There is some sense that valorizing country of origin varieties is very valid and valuable in certain settings and in certain situations. And this, in a way, also emphasizes and celebrates country of origin or national identities. But then at the same time, there seems to be a sense of community built around the wider notion of standard Arabic in this case, that seems to be recognized more readily in the diaspora setting, or at least perceived to be so. And that is something that is shared across nations, across groups really of speakers. Yeah, so you can say that the diverse diaspora setting really encourages some kind of understanding of modern standard Arabic as the universal variety, even if it's not actually spoken in everyday interaction. And in this sense, yeah, it's some kind of ideological element that links individuals across groups. But yes, as I say, it's not actually spoken, and it does create some difficulties, for example, in the setting of supplementary schools, but also one that I didn't speak about today, for example, interpreting and translation settings. Here, a focus on modern standard Arabic is really difficult because that is perceived as a skill by the service provider, for example, when they hire interpreters. That's then also something that individual interpreters are expected to show that they can use that. But then at the very practical level, it's very difficult to use that variety and actually bridge communication gaps. Yeah, so diaspora is a really, really important factor, and the setting in general when we look at language practices. And it will shape the ways that people use their language resources, but the ways also that they prioritize their language resources. And yeah, language ideologies will be reproduced in the diaspora setting, but then also renegotiated. I think, yeah, that was it then. Thank you.
Yeah, really nice. So, yeah, it was really nice. I thought it's not my area of research at all, but I felt very stimulated. I have all kinds of questions, and I hope it definitely deserves questions and a discussion. So if somebody has to leave, no worries. But we can stay for as long as we want, and let's just discuss it first in the room, and then we can ask one or two questions on Zoom as well. So let's give our speaker another round of applause. Very nicely done. And I will see you next time after the Easter break. So happy Easter, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you for all your questions and comments. It was challenging and enriching.